and saying, hey, there are some needs of relocating structures, or there's an opportunity to turn some of these floodplain benches that we talked about in, like, say, number 6 and number 7. What can those be? Can we encourage the public to utilize the river more? Because we're building more friendly access to the river that way. So not necessarily all of the not calculated means that we don't recommend it, but what you can go back into the plan numbers themselves, and we'll talk a little bit about those, or what we'll eventually move forward on for implementation strategy plans. Let's see, the other...
George, on planning and relocation, you talk about elevation there too, as a strategy?
First floor elevation shooting?
I mean, as far as actually elevating structures where appropriate, would that be tied into number 8?
9.
Structural interventions, property
Okay.
protection, that's where that would come in.
So that's, the property protection is going to be elevation and or hardening in place type scenarios?
Wet proofing, dry proofing, no, not usually the dry proofing, we
Okay.
usually wet proofing, raising elevation, first floor elevations, that's a structural interventions, property
Okay.
protection. And what the question was in this is that, so you have certain building types that are eligible to be raised. Buildings that are built on a foundation, you can get underneath them and lift them up and lift that first floor elevation above the water surface elevation during a flood. During that process, utilities are also brought up, which basically removes that house from FEMA's flood insurance rate map. What I mean by that is that it's still located within the boundary of the flood zone, but the elevation of the house is above the 100 years, so then the house gets a lower flood insurance premium. And so that's beneficial because there's no repetitive damage, then all the house and utilities are above the water surface elevation. There's other properties that's not the case, such as buildings built on slab. Basically, in those conditions, you're going to have to knock down everything and rebuild it again, which means you have to bring in earthen fill, build up an earthen pad, and rebuild the building on top of those. So the latter is conditions not counted in the structural dimensions.
On Plan 12, that was not calculated. Refresh my memory, is that because there's no funding source that would cover that much money to do the permanent solution?
I believe that the reason why that wasn't calculated was there was not a frequency known of how often the debris were to come down, because there was only that one flood event that resulted in it. So here on page 98, so that one was, for the not calculated, because it wasn't run through a hydraulic model, because it was just debris management. And then that also, there wasn't enough data points to be able to assign the benefit of cost ratio to it. There's only one episode for that. So those were why they weren't calculated at the end, but those are a managerial solution, administrative solution that we could, construction solution that will be presented moving forward on that. For that particular project, even though they didn't have a prioritization score or a benefit cost score on it.
Yeah,
Jack, the village board voted to proceed with an application to receive funding to do that project. It is on village property, and with Grading's office, the application has been submitted to see if we can get grant monies to cover that project.
Excellent.
So that one there, I mean, we've already, because that was a simple one, because it was on village property, and we only had to get our own approval. We've already looked into, and we're waiting to hear if we can get grant monies to help them with that project.
that went into the consolidated funding round through this SWCD or the strainer. We should know in December, I believe, is when the outcome of that is. We talked to the villages, we believe in that two-phased approach. We're trying to put a strainer in to catch the debris now while we figure out the mitigation strategies for the longer-term bank failures was appropriate. So with their permission, we went forward with that application to see if we can get that funded. So that's in the pipeline, hopefully.
So the last couple of agenda items here is in step 4. So as we alluded to a couple times earlier, we're going to end this project. I know we're all having a lot of fun. It's been a great journey through here, but we do have to say au revoir at some point. And what that step is having a final LFA report that the boards can thumbs up or thumbs down on. Again, like if I'm on base about what that actually means is that when it's signed off on it, it's not actually signing off that we're going to do the mitigation solutions, but we're just signing off on the report itself that this is something that the town will accept as a managerial strategy part. Is that about right? Or is that okay? So what we'd like from you, this is not just a free getaway, is we have to get some feedback from you. So in agenda item 4A, we'd like you to go through this report. And I know time is, everyone's super busy. And if you could, start with the prioritization matrix and agenda item 2. See if there's things that we missed, or if you think that the agreements, the moderate to high scoring isn't right. Start with that, go through it, because then that's the metric, that's the method you're going to be using to review all the mitigation strategies through there. So if your time is pressed, that'd be the best place to spend your time. It's just to make sure that the mitigation solutions and the prioritization that we use are viable to your communities, because you know them best. And then that gets you down to page 135, which is the final table that we're going to take those endpoints and put them into an implementation strategy, which basically is start here, go here, go here, go here. And that would be the final part of the report. And that segues into agenda item 4B, which is the new chapter. Right now, chapter 11 is in acronyms or something like that, so we'll kick that down to chapter 12. And your new chapter 11 will be starting here and moving through the flood resiliency strategies in Delhi. So for example, we talked earlier before about standalone recommendations. Those would be items that have commonality between several mitigation solutions, and we can just pull that out and say, here, this is a standalone recommendation, such as the planning exercise, etc. And then 4C is the voting for the acceptance of the LFA report. Again, date yet to be determined, but it would be optimal if we could get your the pros and cons of Table 71 and any other comments in the LFA report by the end of October. I think that may be
About 10/23 we set as the date. Tomorrow, board members for the town and village will get an email with a link to be able to access the entire report and all the documents with it, so that you can start your review process. And in that email will be George's email, and comments can go directly to him. Also the flood commission members, any more comments we might have after another look through, we can send on to George. George will then accumulate everything and send it on to us for review. We make the changes if necessary.
23rd, Monday.
That's on Monday, does that work?
And then the following regularly scheduled board meetings are the second week in November, usually.
Second weekend in November for the town, second Tuesday in November for town, third Monday for village.
So that's 11/14 for the town, and 11/20 for the village. Okay. What I can do is if I get those comments back, all of them back by the 23rd, that gives me a solid week and a half to reconcile all of those, put them into one document, and answer them, as long as they're substantial and not teasing me that the Red Sox got swept in the playoffs. I can get them out between a week or two in advance of the board meetings, and get a final document out at least 2 weeks before that 14th meeting, unless you want to do a special meeting after that.
Well, if I understand it correctly, the two boards would vote to move forward, but we have to give 30 days for a public notice, for a public meeting, to have a public meeting on this, correct?
I believe, Kristen just left, but I believe you have to have 30 days notice for a public hearing open for comments on the document, if I remember correctly from what we've done previous to this.
So at those two board meetings, we would set a date in the 30-day range
Right.
to have a meeting.
So if you met on those dates in November, for example, you'd probably be adopting in December.
So that would be the timeline for the voting of acceptance for C there, as we're looking at before the end of the year.
Can I ask a quick question? We don't include relocation as something we think is priority in our LFA, and then there's somebody who, a citizen who thinks that they want to do that, and they can justify it. Are we getting in their way by not including it? Okay.
What's part of this in this document is that we show all the buildings that are within the special flood hazard area, and there's a couple of criteria in the CWC funding sources and DEP funding sources for relocation or buyout. There's a couple of programs there. And if they were to demonstrate damage, substantial damage that's done in the last 15 or 20 years or so, or repetitive flooding, then I think they will qualify underneath those programs, as long as they're within a flood-prone area. That's how that works.
But the community still has ultimate say on that. It's with community concurrence. So even any of the recommendations that are in this, you're not obligated to implement any of them type scenario. They're case by case, approval by the municipality. The municipality will always be the ones leading that what they move forward with the alternatives. This is not going to be a top-down approach. It's just not set up like that. So at the end of the day, you'll have a very scientific look at flooding in Delhi. You'll have a range of options and priorities, and what you choose to move forward as a community, it'll be at your pace and when you're ready to go forward with it.
I have to apologize, it's the first meeting I've been to, I don't know where I've been asleep or being advertised. This is the first meeting I've attended. I have not read the report. Is this slope and flood analysis report available to the public, and if so, how do you get a copy?
I think it's posted, or will be posted on the town website.
Is it on it now?
On the village website.
Is it on it now?
No,
No?
no, this new document is not now.
But everyone, the reiterations have been as we went, correct?
Not on my side.
I didn't hear the answer to that last question.
It hasn't been posted publicly because it's still just a working draft.
Okay.
So when does this report become a final report? If this is the draft?
We're
when
gonna
is
do
it
our
not called
December.
draft?
Yeah, we're
December.
doing a final review of this, and then we adopt it as a town and village in, what was the date, December?
December.
So the public can access this draft by going online? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes.
Yes.
You can make access available to it, yes.
We have had several public meetings too.
Pardon?
We have had several public meetings that have been advertised as well. We've had them up to the school.
That's my fault.
No, I'm just trying to make you understand the background, that this is definitely a community process we want all perspectives in on, for sure.
But again, not having read the report, has there been a study made from Fitch's Bridge to Bridge Street on County Route 18? Because I know personally, County 18 has flooded out numerous times in the last 4 or 5 years. where the rivers come out of its back. Is that part of his?
We are basically, our upstream boundary extent is about 500 feet upstream of Legion Ball Fields of Bridge Street, so you know Bridge Street, Page Ave, and soon the ball fields that are right up through there. That was about the most upstream extent of our analysis at that location. And we also looked at Elk Creek tributary up through there. We also did a precursor run through between those two locations, Elk Creek and Bridge Street, and there were no buildings that popped up that were in a flood-prone area. Upstream of Elk Creek, there was one I think we made a note of that there was a storage facility or something that were there from the West Branch. And then upstream of Elk Creek, we didn't look anything upstream of there.
Well, the Elk Creek, was that Elk Creek Road that was on one of the slides here? I think it was number 32 or something. Is that Elk Creek Road or Elk Creek Creek?
That's Elk Creek.
Hamilton Drive.
Right there. That's Elk Creek Road, right there, and that's State Highway 10. Through here.
Right. So, I see.
Elk Creek through here.
All right, so the property, I guess that's to the south of 10, in the lower left-hand corner where it's just about that area there. The next road over is County Highway 18. So is there any study done in that area that's in this report, or is there intended to be in this report?
There's not, and the reason I believe why it was not, when we originally got funding for areas to do the analysis in, it was based on the MOA of 1997 of the Hamlet designated areas was the boundary.
I'm not good with letters.
Oh, okay.
What is MOA?
So that's the memorandum of understanding between the New York City DEP and the upstate communities. The boundaries were designated around your hamlets and your hamlet extensions. The LFA funding was available to anything within that boundary. And actually Elk Creek was something that we asked for in addition to that area outside of that boundary, and were granted permission to do that. So long story short, that, I know exactly where you're speaking about. That was actually not included in this because it was outside of the boundary, and the actual residential area, there wasn't a dense residential area that was impacted by flooding right in that general location. That's not to say 18 doesn't get flooded at a regular basis, because we know it does. And Fitch's Bridge, where it goes around the end of that, we're not ignoring that. That's just didn't fit into the scope of this funding resource here. But that's not something we can't take back with us and say, you know, if somebody looks for, wants a specific recommendation for there, we can look at that in other programs for sure.
And I apologize for asking
No
these
problem.
questions, not having to do the early meetings. Isn't that the vicinity where the proposed DPW building is going to be constructed? And
Yes.
it's not being studied?
No, because that would be on a terrace, it wouldn't even see the flooding anyway.
You got to build across that, what is it?
The West Branch?
Don't, well, yeah, across the
Yeah.
West Branch as well.
So we have active models there. We looked at that. We know what the model looks like there, so we can answer any questions. But that's a real, as I understand what's proposed, where the DPW site is a real high terrace in comparison to the stream itself. And the stream, actually, the 100-year event stays within its banks right there south of the church in that area. In there, you will see flood inundation maps of that area that you can look at. But that is a real high terrace, I do believe, where they were looking there.
But a bridge would have to be constructed across 10 to 18 to access the DPW there, as I understand it. Is that right?
That's what I understand as well. And the area that's actually depicted right there to the left of the church is actually the area, I believe, that was shown. And that area goes from high ground. You'd have to basically, to have no impacts on flooding in that area, you would have to fly the complete span of the Delaware, and your abutments would have to be outside of top of bank and top of bank to not impact flooding in that area. And that is, actually, if you look at it, I believe, I talked about this before, from a Walton all the way to Stanford, look at the Delaware, the West Branch of the Delaware River, that is one of the few spots you can actually fly the Delaware and not have flood implications by putting a bridge structure in there. So if they did target that area, it actually is a good area to look at for a span. I'm not saying community-wise whether it's a good idea or not, but from a hydraulic standpoint, that's one of the few areas in Delaware you could cross it would have no impacts.
The other thing is, we were not asked to include that area in our
Right.
study when we started the flood commission.
Right.
We got no input to add that area
Right.
from the county or anybody like that.
And-
And when we had the public meetings and had the maps up there, where individuals were allowed to, at Delaware Academy, we had public meetings, we had maps laid out, people came up and hand drew on the maps their areas and things like that. None of those areas were ever brought to our attention at that time.
The only time we looked at that is with, when we looked at the Bridge Street Bridge replacement. We said if that had to be eliminated for some reason because it was causing flooding in and around the area, and you still needed to get across to Delaware, we actually looked at that site and said, if you had to do anything to put another bridge in, that would be a good site to put a bridge in. Well, there's no impacts to residential areas there, so it's not part of our study area. You know, we're not trying to recommend from a flood mitigation standpoint, we're not trying to recommend bridges. But once again, that would be one of the few spots you could.
So if it continues to flood on 18, which is known, nothing is being done about it. Is that what I'm understanding?
In this limited study area, you are correct. We did not do an analysis on that.
Thanks, again, I apologize for not.
No problem.
Attending the early meeting.
Person, you said about the meeting up at the high school, that was the first meeting 2 years ago, approximately?
Approximately.
Yeah,
Yeah, year and a half.
I did get a letter since, we could possibly be in the flood area about that meeting. And at that time, I was told anybody that, put their name on the list there, that would be kept informed of future meetings and everything else. But I've never heard anything until I talked to Mark about the meeting here tonight. How do I remedy that, so I'm aware of future meetings?
The only public meetings we've had since those big meetings were the joint meetings of the town and the board, where we've had 2 or 3 of those. I believe this is the 3rd. The others were all working meetings where the flood commission group reviewed
Okay, so they're
documentation,
really-
went through. Yeah, no, there's not been another
Okay.
thing like
High school
that.
meeting.
Now, we're gonna have another public meeting for the adoption of this plan. We're going to have a public meeting
Right.
when all is said and done.
Can I ask a silly question? Or, I'm gonna be a taxpayer. Hi there. Okay. Well, just a silly question. Historically speaking, before New York came in and said that you, John Joe, can't go in the creek and clean it out, years ago, towns, villages would go in and clean those creeks out. Farmers would go in and clean them out, which alleviated a lot of the flooding issues.
Mhm.
Now, have you, historically speaking, done anything based upon that to see, since New York came in the picture and said, no going in, you're not allowed in there anymore? Has the flooding increased due to the fact that you can't go in and clean those creeks anymore?
So the nice thing about what the question is about what we talked a little bit before about in Plattner Brook, where there was a kind of maybe a natural change where the stream bank top is here and the stream bottom elevation is here. And what the question is like, well, you used to be able to go in and lower that stream bed elevation through excavating and bulldozing to keep the channel through there. Now that's a process often referred to as dredging or channel excavation, and that's something that has been looked at, not in this particular FA because that didn't come up with a study, but we've looked at it in different communities where we looked, you could actually put that in the model and say, okay, well if we do dredging, what does it do? And it does a couple of things. One is that often it might not even be the solution because there's other hydraulic problems that are going on that would prevent that from happening, where the water may be getting out upstream of where the dredging is going. Two, what happens with dredging is that the problem comes back again, and we have to continue to do that over and over again because we have debris, gravel, sands, everything that will come down and then fill in that dredging basin, and we have to come back and rescalp it out. So there's an ongoing maintenance problem with that. And then the third and final thing is that the dredging process itself causes instability within the creek. So what happens if we take a channel that's like this and then lower it, all the stream banks that are strong at this height are now very weak because they have to support themselves for a greater, taller distance. So what that ends up happening is that those stream banks collapse, then you have more debris that's pushed on downstream to the next next
Okay.
downstream neighbor.
Well, when you talk about 16 there, 16 was redone back when we had that one flood, when it took out the entire road. Now, if you go down, which this past summer, I mean, I kayak that river all the time.
Mhm.
If you go down where DMV is, where that creek bed goes down in, have you been down in there? That's amazing. I mean, from what the gravel that has gone down through there, it is incredibly high.
Right.
Because it has not been cleaned out in many years. So if you get a lot of water coming down through there now, it's just gonna go back right up to DMV.
So one of the things from a stream management perspective we look at intensively is, we've said this increased precipitation, and it was good when I showed the precipitation graph of how it's changed. A lot of these systems we've developed, your armored walls, your stream bank locations were set in the 50s when you had a lower precipitation in there. Okay, your best engineering decisions were made on that time scale. If you take that same amount of water when they used to dredge back in those areas and put the rainfall we get in it now in those practices, you get devastating results, and that's what we're kind of seeing.
Well, you
What
look at
you're seeing-
Margarettville,
yeah.
remember the mayor of
Sure.
Margarettville, what happened there with the
Yep.
flooding the last time? He was like, blaming it basically
Yeah.
on New York City because
But-
they didn't allow them to go in and clean out
Yep.
the streams anymore.
So it's really difficult to broadly say you need to go in and clean out some of these areas and do what you need to do. The point that you're talking about, where your tributaries are bringing all that excessive load down into your main stem, and then your main stem has a broad, shallow, think about how flat the Delaware is. It's right around 1% or less grade. Think about your tributaries coming in, how steep they are. Your steep ones can carry huge boulders, cars, rocks,
Yeah, sure.
bring it to that and drop it, right? Your main stem's reaction is gonna narrow itself up to get more velocity to carry those things out of there. We're looking at those solutions. How do we deal with those? At what flows and what velocities does that particle actually move? Is it a 5-year event? Because if it's a 5-year event, nobody really cares. You're not going to cause flooding. If it's not mobilized till a 100-year event, you may have a problem there. We're sorting that out on a big scale at stream management. The first thing we know we need to do, like Steel Brook, is go up and actually manage the sources. If you can shut the sources down, now you have a prescriptive measure long-term that you can redimension the channel and have expectations that that will stay within a natural parameter. If you just go in there and dredge the bottom of that thing and lower the bottom, it's going to react all the way upstream, like George said. And you're actually going to bring more material faster than if you left it alone.
Well, but
So
you
we're trying to
look at-
avoid that and balance that.
Right,
in
but you
those
look at
scenarios.
now in the rivers and so forth, I mean, you have trees and so forth that
Sure.
aren't even getting cleaned, what are they creating?
Yeah.
They're creating more of a problem because they're catching all the debris.
Right.
When you have all these trees in the river and then the streams, what are they doing? They're catching everything, which is creating the backup, which is making it come out of its banks. So, I mean, if these trees are at least taken out of the river, I mean, like I say, as a kayaker, I see this all the time in the river. You go
Right.
down through there and it changes the entire course of that river.
Yep.
Because the trees are in the river and not being cleaned out, so you're destroying that river bank by not cleaning anything out. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I understand
Yeah,
that.
and the state, just so everybody knows, the state allows you to take trees out of the stream. It's the private landowner's responsibility to do that, and that's where it doesn't happen. Because there is that mindset of you can't touch a tree, you can't do this, you can't do that. That is not correct. If there are trees in the river, and you're the private landowner that actually owns, with your deeded into that river, it's actually your responsibility. It's yours. And you don't need a permit, and if you don't disturb better banks, you don't need a permit to do that. You can actually cut those and buck them up in place. We do this post-flood into small chunks and either let them go or we cable them up out of there and cut them off the stump. Leave the stump in place because it actually is providing bank protection at some point. What you're describing is correct though. Your trees mobilize, go right in the center of the stream, all of a sudden you have an over-widened situation, you induce deposition by having that. But it's a common misnomer that is a part of stream management that has to be taken up. But the private landowners think they can't touch it, they didn't need a permit, we can't do this. That's not the case.
Well, I think what
the
it is,
dredging, the dredging is
flooding
what
has
they.
happened before, and when that has happened, like in Walton, years ago, I know for a fact my husband's a lineman, and when certain people were trying to get things out of the flooded area, they were told to get the hell out of there.
Yeah, and I
You're
don't.
not allowed in there unless you have a permit to be in there.
See, and I can't speak to that because we actually did, I can't tell you how many miles of channel dimensioning and tree removals, and Walton actually has a very proactive highway superintendent that actually goes through and upstream of culverts where there's potential blocking, they'll take trees that are leaning and they'll actually cut them on the town dollar and pull those trees out of there,
Yeah.
cut them up, leave them for fire, whatever they have to do. They're very proactive about not having their infrastructure impacted by streams.
Right, yeah.
I know CWC has actually developed a program for post-flood, after the next flood, to go in and do debris removal specifically and pay for it. So I think there's a lot of misinformation on what can and cannot be done in and around rivers. The sediment, and this is hard because the sediment is very difficult.
Yeah.
Some of the actions they did in the 70s, I can tell you, probably caused some of the problems you have now.
Well, I mean,
You know
now
what I
if
mean?
you go.
And that's a hard balance
Yeah.
to sort all that out.
But when 16's road was taken out,
Oh, yeah.
they alleviated everything by rebuilding that, basically that stream, whatever you wanna call it,
Mm-hmm.
on the side of 16. But since that time, if you go down behind Domo
Oh, I've
there
been
with that
there.
little
I